We open today with some striking scenes from the Democratic National Convention where pro-Palestinian protesters were praising Hamas and themselves acting rather violent against police and counter-protesters. Some of these protesters are saying they themselves feel betrayed by the Democratic administration for its support of Israel during the war. Dan, who are these thousands of people in the streets? Are they dangerous? And will they ultimately influence Democratic policy on Israel?
Look, I wouldn't discount the danger that comes from woke narratives and some sort of odd nouveau anti-Semitism in the U.S. But let's face it, the events in Chicago so far are nothing of the scale that we saw in 1968. I mean, that was an earthquake in U.S. politics. With all due respect to the campus agitations currently, we're talking here about thousands, not tens of thousands. Only a few dozen seem to try to breach the police barricades, and it seemed to be pretty much the usual suspects of Arab Americans who are understandably up in arms about what's going on, and, you know, some youthful progressives, and therein lies a long-term danger, to be sure. I mean, who are they? Are they dangerous? The danger is that Israel loses the next generation of American liberals. Israel probably cannot maintain its special alliance with the U.S. based purely on evangelicals and conservatives. It used to have the liberals, and as the progressives get more and more powerful on the left, if Israel becomes an enemy of that branch of American politics, it's not a good thing for Israel.
Well, you know, Abe, would you agree with that sentiment? We looked at the Republican convention. Of course, we saw something very different where hostages received a standing ovation, where there were very few protesters that went outside. And of course, they left very quickly because they weren't given much attention. So tell me a little bit about the contrast between those two. And do you believe that it's the Republicans that truly support Israel today? And as Dan said, we've lost the liberal left.
The progressive left.
The progressive left.
Well, I don't know that we've had the progressive left, at least not in some time. Look, the protests that are going on outside say a lot because they really are a reflection of how they feel, how persuadable they feel the people inside might be.
With anti-Semitism rising so sharply in the U.S. over the past decade, particularly in the last year, I think we can say with the war, could this turn into some kind of rift between America and Israel? If anti-Israel sentiment is really anti-Semitism, might Israel find itself losing American support?
Well, actually, I don't believe so, because I think the anti-Zionism, which is anti-Semitism, is actually still a marginal phenomenon in American life. Every poll shows vast American support for Israel continuing. And even among the Democrats, it's now more divided. But when you look at the actual electoral results, candidates that were pro-Israeli really tended to be also more pro-centrist, more from the liberal wing. AIPAC claims to have won all these primary elections, but the truth was they supported pro-Israeli candidates who also tended to be more pro-center. And I think that's the real battle in the Democratic Party, is you win national elections by going to the center. And I think the electoral strategy of trying to appease the far left will not work very well over the next 5-10 years. So I actually think we're seeing the high watermark on some level of the appeal to anti-Semitism or tolerance of anti-Semitism by leadership.
So, Dan, do you agree with that sentiment?
It tends to be true that you win elections by attacking to the center, and we've seen that since Clinton, obviously. But on the other hand, you're looking at a potentially major generational shift. Right now, it's true that most Americans still are Judeo-philic, as you say, and support Israel. But when you see polls suggesting that half the youth in America don't, I don't think it's a profitable strategy to label them all anti-Semitic. There is a major problem that Israel actually is contributing to by the nature of the changes in Israel that are partly demographic but partly political. I don't anticipate a major meeting of the minds and hearts between a future America where these people are in charge and an Israel that continues to go down the path Israel's going, which is in a direction of autocracy, theocracy, and a binational state. These are
It's
reality.
interesting what you're talking about. I mean, we have an election, though, happening in 3 months. And Kamala Harris, it looks like, in the next couple of days, by Thursday, will be given that ticket. I'm wondering, Eric, from your perspective, and hearing what Dan said and hearing what David said, will Harris's stance on Israel impact her ability to bring this election home? Will she be able to go to the White House or not make it because of how she relates to the state of Israel?
Well, what's happening right now is I think the progressive anti-Israel wing, the tail, is waving the liberal wing, the liberal dog. And this is a real problem. I think it's a political problem, because they are not targeting. They've made a decision not to target the independents, the Democrats, the blue dog Democrats, the never Trumpers, people who can go either way. And in states, because this election is going to be decided by maybe 100,000 people in 6 or 7 states, that not targeting those moderates, I think, is a major problem here. They do not want to, to do that. They've chosen to be progressive.
One thing that has to be added is the U.S. has, or historically has had, relatively low participation, and that militates against the going to the center argument, because you also have to fire up your base to get them to vote. When only 60% vote, there is a real chance that the youth won't, and that can swing elections, as it did, for example, with Brexit in the UK. The youth almost didn't vote at all, which is why Brexit won.
It's actually fascinating when you think about voter turnout and how that can either impact the Trump win, even by default, is what you're saying, because people just don't turn out and go to the polls, so they don't vote for Trump, but he wins because not enough people vote for Kamala Harris.
That's more true when participation is low.
I think it's actually impressive how still pro-Israel the American population is. I think most people are not buying what the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is selling.
Right. I think the last poll showed that about 80% of the American population continue to be pro-Israel, despite some of the noise that we hear in the background.
I just wanted to...
Yeah.
So I've been speaking on college campuses for the last 20 plus years, 12 since October 7th. People think that the anti-Semitism just started on October 7th. This has been going on for many, many years. We're into our 3rd generation, and Israel being the colonialist, apartheid, victimizer, all based upon intersectionality, which is what's playing out in one way or another, which basically means people who are aggrieved, victims must stand together. Black Lives Matter, Palestinian Lives Matter. And so I was actually in the State Department 3 weeks ago talking about the reasons why you need to codify what anti-Semitism is, or else you cannot have consequences of what's there. And it gets down to is saying Israel does not have a right to exist as a state, a Jewish state. Is that anti-Semitism? And to my mind, the IHRA definition, which says that, I think is incredibly true, and it should be, because it's very hard to find somebody who's an anti-Zionist who is not having a checklist of many other things in the anti-Semitic sphere, and double standards are a big part of it. So why are these protesters not out there screaming about what goes on in Iran and the misogyny and the gay bashing and things like that?
For sure.
Or why don't they notice that they themselves, as Americans and American white people, are classic colonizers, if there can be such a thing as a colonizer and an indigenous person?
Well, people coming back to their homeland should be something a progressive liberal embraces. But Americans and indigenous peoples, our history is complicated too.
For sure. And in the last day, we've had here Secretary of State Blinken, who has been really pushing for us to sign this ceasefire deal. And in fact, the news last night was that Netanyahu has gotten on board, and our next challenge is to get Hamas to sign. But with that, he has really stressed this idea that we need to end the war. And the realization was that when Netanyahu went to the States, supposedly, we weren't there, but Trump said the same thing. Get the war over with. Some questions about Netanyahu jumping on board. Now, Dan, you're a reporter for a number of years, and it was reported last night out of the meeting, Netanyahu was on board. He gave a speech. After a 3-hour meeting with Blinken, somehow he was magically convinced to support the ceasefire. I don't know. From my perspective, I'm trying to understand, was Netanyahu already on board and just needed that extra push? Or is he on board but not really on board, and the ceasefire is not really going through? I know you're not a prophet, but what's your take on what's going to happen tomorrow?
Well, you mentioned my years as a journalist. If they taught me anything, it's not to put much stock in what politicians say in public, and that goes double during wartime, and that goes triple during negotiations. So I don't believe Blinken any more than I believe Netanyahu, which is very, very little. I don't think we have time here to go into the details of the essentialness of the Philadelphia corridor, whether Israel really needs it or not, and whether Israel truly just woke up to that after agreeing on May 31st to forego the Philadelphia corridor. Yeah. I think the reality is that Netanyahu is under tremendous pressure, not only from the Americans, without which he cannot conduct a war, but also from the Israeli people, 3/4 of whom want him to prioritize the hostages and understand that he can live to fight another day under better circumstances without one hand tied because of the hostages, should that leave Hamas somehow in power in Gaza. And he's reacting, I think, mainly to that. But in reality, I'm just not a prophet. I don't have powers of telepathy. And I think we're dealing here with a situation that is basically a function of the decisions of two individuals, tragically, two individuals who tragically are Sinwar, an arch-terrorist clearly prepared to sacrifice half of his people to achieve amorphous ends, and Netanyahu, a cynical dissembler who will, I think, in my assessment, I've known him since 1988, do anything to cling to power.
We are actually over time, so we really have to answer in just about 10 seconds. And this question is for Dan and for Abe, but really 10 seconds. The one question is, given everything that we discussed today, who should the American Jewish community be voting for? Is it Donald Trump, or is it, if she does become the candidate this week, which it seems like she will, Kamala Harris? Abe, you start. Dan, you finish, but 10 seconds each.
I think there is a fear that this administration and the Harris administration will continue to play with the lives of 10 million Israelis and 6 million American Jews. And I think a lot of them will look at that and say, not this year, not these Democrats.
You know, a lot of anti-Semitism is driven by the notion of dual loyalties. I think American Jews should vote for what they think is good for America. But that said, what's good for Israel is not necessarily automatic support for Israel's right-wing government.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have this evening.